As the day quietly fades and stars begin to whisper above, welcome to Korean History Whispers. Tonight, we gently explore the heart and mind of King Jeongjo. While his reign is chronicled in history, tonight you will glimpse the dreams and ambitions that shaped it. Close your eyes and let his whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep. In the autumn of 1752, within the ancient walls of Cheonggyeong Palace, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The night before his birth, thunder rolled across the Korean sky like the drums of heaven itself. Lightning split the darkness, and witnesses swore they saw dozens of dragons writhing upward through the storm clouds, as if the celestial realm was announcing the arrival of someone destined for greatness. Prince Sado and Lady Hwaseong had already lost one precious son, and their hearts still ached with that loss. But on the 22nd of September, as rain drummed against the palace roof, their second child entered the world. The baby's grandfather, King Jeongjo, took one look at the infant's face, and saw his own features reflected there. This child, he declared with tears of joy, would be named San, and he would be the royal grandson who would carry their dynasty forward. From his very first breath, this child seemed touched by something beyond the ordinary world. Before he could even speak properly, little San would light up at the sight of written characters, reaching for books with tiny hands that seemed to understand their power instinctively. While other royal children played with golden toys, San gravitated toward paintings that told stories of virtue and wisdom, as if some inner compass guided him toward knowledge rather than pleasure. The palace servants whispered among themselves about the strange child who preferred scrolls to silk, who would rather trace the elegant curves of calligraphy than chase butterflies in the gardens. When his first birthday arrived and tradition demanded he choose from an array of objects that would predict his future, the toddler ignored the jewels, the weapons, and the coins. His small hand reached unerringly for a book, grasping it as if it were the most precious treasure in the kingdom. By 1754, when San was barely 2 years old, King Jeongjo established a special education center dedicated entirely to nurturing his grandson's extraordinary mind. The old king had ruled for decades, weathering countless storms of palace intrigue and political upheaval. But nothing had prepared him for the wonder of watching this child learn. When San began reading the Sohak, the fundamental text of Confucian education, at age 3, he didn't just memorize the characters. He absorbed their meaning with an intensity that both thrilled and concerned his teachers. The boy would wake before dawn, wash in the cold palace water, and settle into his studies while the rest of the world still slept. His mother, Lady Hwaseong, worried about his health, fearing that such dedication might break his small body. But San had already learned to hide his lamp behind screens, studying by candlelight in secret. When the adults tried to make him rest, knowledge had become his oxygen, and he breathed it as naturally as the morning air. In February of 1759, at age 7, San was formally designated as heir to the throne, receiving the title of royal grandson in a ceremony that filled the great hall of Myeonjeong with golden light and solemn music. His grandfather personally wrote out passages from the Sohak in his own elegant calligraphy, presenting them to the child as both gift and challenge. The weight of a kingdom's future settled on shoulders still small enough to fit in a man's arms. But San carried it without flinching. 2 years later, when he accompanied his grandfather on a royal procession through the capital, the crowds that lined the street saw something that took their breath away. Here was a 9-year-old child who carried himself with the dignity of a seasoned ruler, yet whose eyes still sparkled with the curiosity of youth. When King Jeongjo tested him before the gathered people, asking what the citizens hoped for from their future king, San's answer rang clear and true across the square. "They hope for goodness, grandfather." The old king pressed further, wondering if his grandson understood the difficulty of the path ahead. "Is it easy or hard to do good in this world?" Without hesitation, the boy replied, "It is easy." because believing it is easy gives us the courage to move forward boldly. In that moment, watching his grandson speak with wisdom that seemed to flow from some deep well within, King Jeongjo felt his heart swell with pride and hope. This child would not just inherit a throne, he realized. He would transform it, but the palace was also a place where brilliance could be dangerous, where exceptional gifts attracted both admiration and deadly envy. Even as young San dazzled scholars with questions so sophisticated they struggled to answer them. Shadows were gathering around his family. Political factions watched and waited, calculating how this remarkable child might upset the delicate balance of power they had spent decades constructing. The boy's own father, Crown Prince Sado, found himself caught in an impossible position. Blessed with intelligence and sensitivity, but cursed with the kind of mental anguish that turned inward like a poisonous flower. Sado struggled under the weight of his father's expectations and his own tortured psyche. The very qualities that made his son extraordinary, the focus and determination that came so naturally to San, seemed to elude the crown prince entirely, as San grew more brilliant with each passing season, absorbing knowledge like sunlight and radiating wisdom beyond his years. The distance between father and son became a chasm that neither could cross. The child studied with monks and scholars, debated philosophy with court officials, and composed poetry that moved listeners to tears. But the one person whose approval might have healed his young heart remained forever just out of reach, locked in battles with demons that no amount of filial love could conquer. In 1762, when San was just 11 years old, the unthinkable happened. The political pressures, the psychological torment, and the impossible contradictions of palace life finally converged in a moment of unspeakable tragedy. Crown Prince Sado, the brilliant and troubled father who had given this extraordinary child life, was forced into a rice chest by his own father's command, and left to die in the sweltering summer heat. The boy who had never known defeat in scholarship, who had never encountered a problem his keen mind couldn't solve, suddenly faced the one puzzle that had no answer. His father was gone, not to illness or accident, but to the brutal machinery of royal politics. In a single horrific moment, San learned that intelligence and virtue, no matter how profound, might not be enough to protect the people you love from the darkness that lurked in the shadows of power. 4 days afterward, the 11-year-old prince stayed close to his grandfather, never leaving the old king's side during daylight hours, as if his presence alone could somehow prevent another loss. At night, he sought comfort with Lady Yeonbin, one of his grandfather's concubines who had shown him kindness. When she fell gravely ill 2 years later, San nursed her with the same devotion he might have shown his own mother, and when she died, he mourned her as if she had been family. Meanwhile, separated from his own mother by palace protocol and political necessity, San lived with a loneliness that cut deeper than any physical wound. When word came that Lady Haejeong was ill, he would refuse all food until messengers brought news of her recovery. His love had become a kind of exquisite torture. Each separation, a reminder of how quickly those he cherished could be torn away. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this extraordinary child was not his brilliance or his sensitivity, but his resilience. Instead of allowing tragedy to break him, San seemed to absorb even suffering as if it were another kind of knowledge, another subject to master. His father's death became not just a source of grief, but a lesson about the deadly games played at the highest levels of power. Every tear he shed in private became fuel for the determination that burned ever brighter within him. By July of 1762, King Jeongjo had made his decision. Following the precedent set by Chinese dynasties, he established San as the heir apparent, creating the Eastern Palace with all its attendant institutions and ceremonies. The boy who had lost his father would not lose his destiny. If anything, the tragedy seemed to sharpen his focus, turning him into a student not just of books and philosophy, but of power itself and all its terrible complexities. As the seasons turned and San grew from child to young man, those who watched him began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not just another royal prince being groomed for eventual rule. This was a mind of exceptional power that had been forged in the furnace of tragedy, tempered by loss, and shaped by an unshakable determination to transform the very nature of kingship itself. The dragons that had danced through the storm clouds on the night of his birth had not been wrong. San would indeed become someone extraordinary. But first, he would have to survive the palace intrigue that had already claimed his father, navigate the treacherous currents of factional politics, and prove that a king could be more than just a symbol of authority. He would have to become exactly what his kingdom needed most. A ruler whose power came not from fear, but from wisdom. A leader who understood that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the courage to transform them into allies. The boy who had chosen books over toys, knowledge over pleasure, and truth over comfort was about to begin the most dangerous education of all. He was about to learn how to be a king who could change the world. The tragedy that shattered young San's world became the crucible that forged his extraordinary character. In July of 1762, just 2 months after his father's death, King Jeongjo made a decision that would reshape the kingdom's future. Following the ancient precedent of Chinese dynasties, he established the Eastern Palace, creating new institutions to nurture and protect the heir who had already faced more darkness than most men would encounter in a lifetime. The creation of the Chunbang and Jibang institutions meant more than just administrative reorganization. It was the old king's way of building a fortress of knowledge and protocol around his grandson, ensuring that no force on earth could deny the boy his rightful destiny. Son would attend state meetings and scholarly conferences, absorbing not just the theory of governance but its brutal realities. Every question his grandfather posed about ancient texts or current crises received answers that left seasoned ministers shaking their heads in amazement. But the palace remained a treacherous place where brilliance could be as dangerous as weakness. Even as San demonstrated wisdom far beyond his years, there were those who whispered that the son of a disgraced prince had no right to wear the crown. The boy who had chosen books over toys now had to navigate a political landscape where every word carried the weight of life and death, where every gesture was scrutinized for signs of his father's alleged instability. In 1764, when San was 12, King Jeongjo made another crucial decision that revealed both his political genius and his deep love for his grandson. Rather than allowing San to inherit directly from grandfather to grandson, which might invite challenges to legitimacy, he declared that the succession would pass through Prince Kyujanggak, his deceased elder son, making San the heir of that lineage rather than a direct descendant of the controversial Crown Prince Sado. Antist's maneuver was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. It meant that San's claim to the throne could not be challenged on the grounds of his father's disgrace. But it also meant that the boy had to live with the knowledge that his own father had been officially erased from the royal succession. The pain of this political necessity cut deeper than any physical wound, but San absorbed it as he had absorbed everything else, transforming personal anguish into an unshakable determination to prove himself worthy of the crown. Years passed like seasons of intensive preparation. San grew from a precocious child into a formidable young scholar whose intellectual capacity seemed to expand with each passing day. He studied military strategy with the same intensity he brought to poetry, mastered statecraft with the focus he applied to philosophy, but perhaps most importantly, he learned to read the human heart with the same precision he brought to ancient texts. The court watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Here was a prince who could debate the finest points of Confucian ethics with the kingdom's greatest scholars, then turn around and demonstrate an intuitive understanding of military tactics that impressed battle-hardened generals. His memory was so perfect that he could recite entire classics after reading them once. Yet he showed no trace of the arrogance that such gifts might inspire in others. But it was not just San's intellectual abilities that set him apart. There was something in his character that seemed forged from a deeper fire. A quality of moral certainty that made even his political enemies grudgingly respect him. When he spoke about justice or duty, his words carried the weight of someone who had stared into the abyss of human cruelty and emerged with his principles intact. In November of 1774, when San was 22, the moment everyone had been preparing for finally arrived. King Jeongjo, now in his 80s and feeling the full weight of his long reign, announced his intention to step back from active governance and allow his grandson to serve as regent. The old king had ruled for over 5 decades, weathering countless storms and transforming the kingdom in ways that would have seemed impossible when he first took the throne. But now, he was ready to pass the torch to the young man who had become everything he had hoped for and more. The announcement sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Hong In-han and other powerful court figures who had grown comfortable with the existing power structure suddenly faced the prospect of a young regent whose intelligence and moral authority they could not hope to match or manipulate. They had spent years positioning themselves as indispensable advisors to an aging king. But now they found themselves confronting a brilliant young leader who needed no guidance and would accept no corruption. Their attempts to block the regency were swift and vicious. They questioned San's readiness, raised doubts about his temperament, and even suggested that the kingdom was not ready for such a dramatic change in leadership. But their opposition only served to highlight the contrast between their self-serving motivations and San's obvious qualifications. When Seo Myung-seon submitted his memorial supporting the regency and exposing the corrupt motives of those who opposed it, the political tide turned decisively in San's favor. In December of 1774, in the stately hall of Gyeonggno, Prince San formally began his regency. King Jeongjo presented him with the royal seal and official documents that granted him full authority to govern the kingdom. But more than just symbols of power, these items represented something far more precious. They were proof that his grandfather's faith in him had never wavered. That despite all the political storms and personal tragedies, the bond between them had remained unbreakable. The young regent's first acts in power revealed both his political sophistication and his unwavering moral compass. Rather than seeking revenge against those who had opposed his appointment, he focused on demonstrating through his actions that their concerns had been unfounded. He threw himself into the work of governance with the same intensity he had once brought to his studies, mastering the complexities of taxation, military organization, and diplomatic relations with a speed that left seasoned administrators struggling to keep pace. But San's true genius lay not in his ability to understand systems, but in his capacity to understand people. He recognized that the kingdom's problems could not be solved through administrative efficiency alone. The deep-rooted corruption that had poisoned the court for generations, the factional rivalries that had paralyzed effective governance, the growing gap between the ruling elite and the common people. All of these challenges required not just intelligence but wisdom, not just knowledge but moral authority. Even as he proved his capabilities as a regent, San never forgot the lessons of his father's tragedy. He understood that power without virtue was meaningless, that authority without legitimacy was fragile, and that a king who could not earn the respect of his people had no right to their obedience. Every decision he made, every policy he implemented, every appointment he authorized was guided by a vision of what the kingdom could become under truly enlightened leadership. The political establishment that had initially opposed his regency found themselves in an impossible position. They could not criticize his performance, because his competence was obvious to everyone. They could not question his character, because his integrity was beyond reproach. And they could not ignore his growing popularity among both the scholarly class and the common people, who saw in him a leader who actually cared about their welfare rather than just his own power. As 1776 dawned, Everyone in the kingdom understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The young regent had not just survived the political machinations that had destroyed his father. He had transformed them into the foundation of his own moral authority. The boy who had once been seen as a potential weakness in the royal succession had become its greatest strength. On the 10th of March, 1776, in the solemn dignity of Gyeongguk Palace's Sungjin Hall, 24-year-old San ascended to the throne as King Jeongjo. The ceremony that had been planned 4 years unfolded with all the ancient ritual and contemporary significance that such a moment demanded. But for those who knew the new king's history, the real meaning of the day was not in the formal protocols, but in the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this point. In his first royal proclamation, King Jeongjo made clear that he intended to rule not just as the heir of his grandfather's legacy, but as the son of his father's memory. He announced his intention to honor Prince Hojang, as his predecessor had wished. But he also declared that his debt to his biological father could never be forgotten or abandoned. It was a statement of breathtaking political courage. A declaration that he would not allow the circumstances of his father's death to define the character of his reign. The new king's early actions revealed the sophistication of his political thinking and the depth of his commitment to reform. Rather than simply punishing those who had been involved in his father's death, he focused on dismantling the system that had made such a tragedy possible. He understood that lasting change could not be built on revenge, but only on the creation of new institutions and new standards that would prevent such abuses of power in the future. As word of the new king's vision spread throughout the kingdom, people began to dare to hope for something that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. A ruler who combined the intellectual brilliance of the greatest scholars with the moral authority of the most revered sages. Someone who could not only understand the kingdom's problems but actually solve them. The boy who had been born amid dragons dancing through storm clouds was now a king whose reign would prove that sometimes the most devastating tragedies can give birth to the most extraordinary transformations. The young man who had learned to channel his grief into determination, his anger into wisdom, and his pain into compassion was about to begin the most ambitious experiment in governmental reform that his kingdom had ever seen. Years of preparation were over. The real work was just beginning. The kingdom that King Jeongjo inherited in 1776 was a realm teetering on the edge of transformation. Centuries of factional warfare had poisoned the political atmosphere, turning what should have been collaborative governance into a series of blood feuds that consumed the energy and talent of entire generations. The new king understood that cosmetic changes would not be enough. What was needed was nothing less than a complete reimagining of how power could be exercised in service of wisdom rather than ambition. But Jeongjo's vision extended far beyond simply managing existing conflicts. He dreamed of creating an entirely new kind of political culture, one where merit would triumph over connections, where intellectual excellence would be valued above factional loyalty, and where the brightest minds in the kingdom could work together regardless of their family backgrounds or regional origins. It was an audacious dream, the kind of transformative vision that could either revolutionize a civilization or destroy the dreamer who dared to pursue it. The instrument through which this transformation would be achieved already existed in embryonic form. The Kyujanggak, or Royal Library, had been established in the first year of Jeongjo's reign, as a modest institution for preserving royal documents and conducting scholarly research. But in the king's imagination, it was destined to become something far more significant. The intellectual heart of a new kind of government, a place where the kingdom's most talented individuals could gather to study, debate, and develop the policies that would guide the nation into a new age. By 1781, 5 years into his reign, Jeongjo had transformed this initial concept into a fully realized institution that would have been unrecognizable to previous generations of Korean rulers. The Kyujanggak was no longer just a library, but a complete alternative to the traditional governmental structure. Its scholars were granted the same honors and authorities that had previously been reserved for the established institutions of Hongmengwan, Yemingwan, Sahyunbu, and Saganwan. But unlike those ancient institutions, which had become calcified by centuries of factional politics, the Kyujanggak represented something entirely new. A meritocracy based on intellectual ability rather than family connections. The king understood that creating new institutions was only the first step. For his vision to succeed, he needed to fill those institutions with individuals who shared his commitment to placing the welfare of the kingdom above their own personal interests. This meant identifying and nurturing talent wherever it could be found, regardless of whether it came from established, noble families or from regions that had traditionally been excluded from power. The recruitment process itself became a revolutionary act. Traditional examinations had long been dominated by candidates from powerful families who could afford years of expensive preparation and who already knew the political connections necessary for advancement. Jeongjo instituted new forms of testing that emphasized practical problem-solving abilities and creative thinking, rather than rote memorization of classical texts. He also created special examinations for scholars from remote provinces, ensuring that geographical distance would no longer be a barrier to participation in national governance. But perhaps most controversially, the king began to look beyond the traditional boundaries of the scholarly class entirely. He created opportunities for individuals from the Chungin class, the technical specialists who had previously been excluded from high-level policy discussions, despite their expertise in practical matters like medicine, astronomy, and engineering. Even more shocking to traditional sensibilities, he began to consider petitions from those of mixed ancestry who had historically been barred from government service regardless of their qualifications. The established political factions watched these developments with growing alarm. They understood that Jeongjo was not simply trying to reform the existing system, but was attempting to replace it entirely with something that would render their carefully cultivated networks of influence obsolete. The king's vision of a government run by the most capable individuals rather than the most well-connected ones represented an existential threat to everything they had spent their lives building. Their resistance took many forms, from subtle attempts at sabotage to open challenges to royal authority. They questioned whether untested scholars could handle the complexities of real governance, whether regional outsiders could understand the delicate balance of court politics, whether individuals from noble backgrounds possess the moral cultivation necessary for leadership positions. But every criticism they raised only served to highlight the contrast between their own self-serving motivations and the king's genuine commitment to finding the best possible solutions to the kingdom's problems. Jeongjo's response to this resistance revealed both his political sophistication and his unwavering commitment to his principles. Rather than allowing himself to be drawn into the kind of factional warfare that had paralyzed previous administrations, he insisted on judging every individual and every policy based on their actual performance, rather than their theoretical allegiances. When members of traditionally hostile factions demonstrated genuine competence and integrity, he promoted them. When members of supposedly friendly factions proved themselves corrupt or incompetent, he removed them from office. This approach required an extraordinary level of personal involvement from the king himself. Jeongjo could not simply rely on the recommendations of established advisors, because those advisors were often compromised by their own factional loyalties. Instead, he had to personally evaluate the character and capabilities of hundreds of potential appointees, studying their written work, observing their behavior in various situations, and gradually building a comprehensive understanding of who could be trusted with the enormous responsibility of governing a kingdom. The results of this intensive personal approach began to manifest themselves in ways that surprised even the king's supporters. Government efficiency improved dramatically as positions were filled by individuals who actually understood their responsibilities rather than those who had simply inherited their roles through family connections. Policy innovations emerged from the collaborative environment of the Kyujanggak that would have been impossible under the rigid hierarchies of traditional administration. Most importantly, a new sense of energy and optimism began to permeate the court as capable individuals from all backgrounds realized that merit and dedication would actually be rewarded. But Jeongjo's most ambitious goals extended far beyond administrative reform. He believed that the transformation of government was only meaningful if it ultimately served to improve the lives of ordinary people throughout the kingdom. This meant that his scholarly advisors could not simply engage in abstract theoretical discussions but had to develop practical solutions to real problems. How to increase agricultural productivity, how to manage the growing complexity of commercial relationships, how to maintain military readiness without bankrupting the treasury, how to preserve cultural traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. The intellectual environment that emerged from these challenges was unlike anything that had ever existed in Korean history. The Kyujanggak became a place where traditional Confucian scholarship intersected with practical engineering knowledge, where ancient philosophical principles were applied to contemporary policy dilemmas, where the wisdom of the past was combined with innovative approaches to future problems. The king himself played a central role in fostering this intellectual renaissance. Despite the overwhelming demands of royal duties, he maintained his own rigorous schedule of study and research, often working through the night to master new subjects or to understand the implications of proposals submitted by his advisors. His personal library grew to enormous proportions as he collected works from across East Asia, seeking insights that could be adapted to Korean circumstances. But perhaps even more importantly, Jeongjo created an atmosphere in which intellectual curiosity was not just tolerated but actively encouraged. Scholars were invited to challenge conventional wisdom, to propose radical solutions to long-standing problems, and to engage in the kind of creative thinking that had been discouraged under previous administrations. The king made it clear that he valued advisors who could present him with new perspectives rather than those who simply told him what they thought he wanted to hear. This approach inevitably led to confrontations with more conservative elements within the scholarly community who believed that wisdom resided primarily in faithful adherence to established truth. Some criticized the king's openness to foreign ideas, particularly the growing influence of Northern learning, which emphasized practical knowledge and technological innovation over purely theoretical scholarship. The most serious challenge came from those who viewed the emerging interest in Western learning, including Christian ideas, as a fundamental threat to the Confucian foundation of Korean civilization. They argued that any compromise with foreign religious or philosophical systems would inevitably lead to the collapse of the moral order that had sustained the kingdom for centuries. Jeongjo's response to these ideological controversies revealed the sophisticated balance he sought to maintain between innovation and tradition. He refused to accept the premise that intellectual curiosity about new ideas necessarily constituted a betrayal of fundamental principles. Instead, he argued that true Confucian scholarship required the kind of rigorous investigation and critical thinking that could distinguish between genuinely valuable insights and potentially harmful innovations. At the same time, he recognized that some of his most talented advisors, including Yi Go-en and Jen Yuk-young, had indeed been influenced by Western ideas, in ways that made them vulnerable to accusations of heterodoxy. Rather than abandoning these individuals to their critics, the king chose to protect them while also making clear that intellectual exploration had to be balanced with awareness of its potential social and political implications. His protective stance required considerable political courage, because it meant that Jeongjo was effectively taking personal responsibility for the ideological reliability of individuals whose thinking had already attracted suspicion. He was gambling his own reputation on his ability to distinguish between genuine threats to social stability and merely unfamiliar approaches to familiar problems. The king's confidence in this approach was based on his deep conviction that the strength of Confucian civilization lay not in its rigidity, but in its capacity for moral He believed that ideas that were truly valuable would prove their worth over time, while those that were genuinely harmful would eventually reveal their deficiencies. What was needed was not censorship, but the kind of informed discussion and careful evaluation that could only take place in an environment of intellectual freedom. As the 1780s progressed, the fruits of Jeongjo's educational and administrative reforms became increasingly evident throughout the kingdom. The quality of government service improved markedly as positions were filled by individuals selected for their competence rather than their connections. Policy innovations emerged from the collaborative environment of the Kyujanggak that addressed long-standing problems with unprecedented effectiveness. Most importantly, a new generation of scholar administrators was emerging that combined deep learning with practical wisdom, theoretical knowledge with administrative skill. But the king understood that institutional reform, however successful, was only meaningful if it ultimately served to improve the actual conditions of life for the people he governed. The true test of his revolutionary vision would come not in the refined atmosphere of the Kyujanggak, but in the rice fields and marketplaces, the workshops and villages where ordinary Koreans struggled to build better lives for themselves and their families. The Scholar King's most audacious experiment was about to begin. The kingdom that had taken shape under Jeongjo's intellectual leadership was magnificent in theory, but the king understood that true greatness could only be measured by its impact on the lives of ordinary people. The scholars of the Kyujanggak had produced brilliant analyses of economic theory and social policy, but now those theories had to be tested in the real world of farming villages, commercial districts, and frontier settlements where the kingdom's future would ultimately be determined. The challenges were enormous and interconnected in ways that defied simple solutions. The kingdom's finances had been strained for generations by the competing demands of military preparedness, court expenses, and infrastructure maintenance. Meanwhile, the distribution of land ownership had become increasingly unequal, concentrating wealth in the hands of a few powerful families, while leaving growing numbers of farmers with insufficient resources to support their families. Commercial activity was hampered by corrupt practices and outdated regulations that protected established interests at the expense of innovation and efficiency. Jeongjo approached these problems with the same systematic methodology he had applied to administrative reform. Rather than attempting to impose theoretical solutions from above, he and his advisors began by conducting detailed investigations into actual conditions throughout the kingdom. Teams of scholars were dispatched to study agricultural techniques, commercial practices, and local governance in different regions, reporting back with comprehensive analyses that formed the foundation for policy development. The king's personal involvement in this research process was as intensive as his engagement with administrative matters had been. He studied reports on crop yields and weather patterns with the same attention he devoted to diplomatic correspondence, analyzed tax collection data with the same rigor he applied to military intelligence, examined trade statistics with the same care he gave to judicial precedents. Nothing was too detailed or too mundane to escape his scrutiny if it might contribute to understanding how the kingdom's economy actually functioned. The insights that emerged from this investigation were both encouraging and disturbing. On one hand, the kingdom possessed enormous untapped potential for increased productivity and prosperity. Korean farmers were skilled and hard-working. Korean craftsmen were capable of producing goods that could compete with the finest products from neighboring countries. Korean merchants were enterprising and resourceful when given the opportunity to operate freely. On the other hand, this potential was being systematically squandered by institutional arrangements that prioritized the preservation of existing privileges over the promotion of general welfare. The solution that gradually took shape in the king's mind was characteristically ambitious. Rather than attempting to reform the existing system incrementally, he would create an entirely new model of economic and social organization that could demonstrate the possibilities inherent in more rational and equitable arrangements. This model would be implemented initially in a single location where it could be carefully monitored and refined, then gradually extended throughout the kingdom as its advantages became apparent. The location he chose for this extraordinary experiment was Hwaseong, a new city that would be built around the relocated tomb of his father, Crown Prince Sado. The selection of this site was both practically and symbolically perfect. Practically, it would allow the king to design every aspect of the city's layout and governance from scratch, unencumbered by existing institutions or vested interests. Symbolically, it would transform the site of his family's greatest tragedy into the foundation of his kingdom's greatest triumph. The construction of Hwaseong began in the early 1790s, and immediately demonstrated the practical benefits of the king's approach to governance. Rather than simply commanding that a fortress be built according to traditional methods, Jeongjo insisted that the latest engineering knowledge be applied to every aspect of the project. New techniques for stone cutting and transportation reduced costs while improving quality. Innovative designs for defensive structures combined maximum military effectiveness with aesthetic beauty. Advanced planning methods ensured that the construction process proceeded efficiently and safely, but the king's vision extended far beyond the fortress walls themselves. Hwaseong was conceived as a complete urban environment that would demonstrate how economic, social, and political institutions could be organized to promote both individual prosperity and communal welfare. The city would be largely self-sufficient, producing its own food through scientifically managed agriculture while generating additional income through carefully planned commercial activities. The agricultural component of this plan involved the establishment of government-managed farms that would serve as laboratories for testing new crops and cultivation techniques. Rather than relying on traditional methods that had remained unchanged for centuries, these farms would systematically experiment with innovations that might increase yields, improve soil quality, or extend growing seasons. The knowledge gained from these experiments would then be shared with farmers throughout the kingdom, gradually raising agricultural productivity across the entire realm. The commercial aspect of the Hwaseong experiment was equally innovative. The king arranged for experienced merchants to relocate to the new city, offering them favorable terms and regulatory environments that would encourage entrepreneurship while ensuring fair competition. Markets were organized according to principles that protected consumers from fraud while providing producers with reliable outlets for their goods. Credit systems were established that would allow small businesses to expand without falling into the debt traps that had historically constrained commercial development. Perhaps most remarkably, the social organization of Hwaseong reflected Jeongjo's commitment to the meritocratic principles he had implemented in government administration. While the city maintained appropriate respect for traditional hierarchies, advancement within its institutions was based primarily on demonstrated competence rather than inherited status. Talented individuals from modest backgrounds could earn positions of responsibility, while those from prestigious families were expected to prove their worth through actual performance. The king's personal involvement in every aspect of the Hwaseong project was as intensive as his engagement with other aspects of governance had been. He regularly visited the construction sites, consulted with engineers and architects about technical problems, reviewed agricultural reports with the same attention he devoted to diplomatic intelligence, and personally interviewed candidates for key administrative positions within the new city. As Hwaseong neared completion in the late 1790s, its success exceeded even the king's ambitious expectations. The city had become a showcase for everything that was possible when human talent was properly organized and directed. Its defenses were more sophisticated than anything that had existed in Korea previously, incorporating the latest advances in military engineering while maintaining the aesthetic elegance that reflected the kingdom's cultural values. Its economic activities generated prosperity for inhabitants while contributing to the royal treasury. Its social institutions demonstrated that hierarchy and merit could coexist in ways that promoted both stability and progress. But the true significance of Hwaseong lay not in its individual achievements, but in its potential as a model for the transformation of the entire kingdom. Every innovation that proved successful in the new city could potentially be adapted for implementation elsewhere. Every institution that functioned effectively could serve as a template for similar institutions in other locations. Every policy that promoted prosperity and harmony could be extended to benefit all of the king's subjects. Jeongjo understood that he was creating more than just a city. He was demonstrating the possibility of a completely different kind of civilization. One that combined the moral wisdom of traditional Confucian culture with the practical effectiveness of modern administrative methods. If this experiment succeeded, it could serve as the foundation for reforms that would transform not just his own kingdom, but potentially influence the development of East Asian civilization for centuries to come. The king's vision for the future was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. He had planned to rule until 1804. When his son would reach the age of 15 and could assume the throne with the benefit of observing a fully mature example of enlightened governance. The intervening years would be devoted to extending the Hwaseong model throughout the kingdom, gradually transforming every aspect of Korean society according to the principles that had proven successful in the experimental city. The economic reforms would eventually eliminate the inefficiencies and inequities that had constrained prosperity for generations. Agricultural innovations would ensure adequate food supplies for a growing population while generating surplus resources that could support expanded commercial activities. Administrative improvements would create a government that served the people's interests rather than exploiting them for the benefit of privileged elites. Most importantly, the cultural transformation would produce a new kind of Korean civilization that maintained its distinctive identity while embracing the intellectual and technological advances that were reshaping the world. The kingdom would become a place where traditional values and modern methods reinforced each other rather than competing, where moral cultivation and practical competence were seen as complementary rather than contradictory, where the wisdom of the past informed creative responses to contemporary challenges. But in the summer of 1800, when Jeongjo was just 48 years old, and his great experiment was still in its early stages, death arrived without warning or ceremony. The king, who had survived political assassination attempts, factional conspiracies, and decades of administrative battles, was claimed by a sudden illness that gave him no opportunity to complete the transformation he had begun. The loss was devastating not just for the royal family but for the entire kingdom. In the space of a few days, the driving force behind 24 years of unprecedented reform was gone, leaving behind institutions that depended on his personal leadership, policies that required his continued oversight, and a vision of the future that had been uniquely his own. The scholars of the Kyujanggak, the administrators of Hwaseong, the farmers and merchants and craftsmen who had benefited from his reforms, all understood that they had lost more than just a king. They had lost the architect of a new kind of civilization, the protector of a dream that might never be fully realized, the embodiment of possibilities that might never again find such perfect expression. Yet the legacy of King Jeongjo's reign could not be erased by his death. The institutions he had created continued to function, the policies he had implemented continued to benefit his subjects, and the example he had set continued to inspire those who shared his vision of what enlightened governance could achieve. The boy who had been born amid dragons dancing through storm clouds had indeed transformed his kingdom, proving that wisdom and virtue, when combined with political power, could create changes that would endure long after their creator was gone. In the quiet halls of the Kyujanggak, where scholars still gathered to study and debate, in the prosperous streets of Hwaseong, where merchants and farmers continued to pursue their dreams, in the hearts and minds of all those who had witnessed what was possible when a truly great leader devoted himself to serving his people, rather than merely ruling them. The spirit of King Jeongjo's vision lived on. The Dragon Prince had kept his promise to the storm clouds that had announced his birth. He had indeed become extraordinary, not through conquest or accumulation of wealth, but through the patient work of building a better world for those who would come after him. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest legacy any king could leave behind. Close your eyes and let these whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep.